What's up, everybody? It's your boy Coach Mills here, coming at you with a brand new Valorant video. And in this video, we're going to be breaking down how to dominate eco rounds for an easy rank up. Because the first two rounds of any given half and how you play them can have a dramatic effect on your win rate. Specifically, that pistol round, and then that secondary round where you either force up because you have enough money because you won, or you actually force even though you lost to try to throw the enemy off their snowball. And we're going to be breaking these rounds down so that you know exactly what to do in your games to pop off and up that win rate for an easy climb this competitive act. But go to the gameplay website in the description down below for the highest quality guides that you'll find anywhere. Not to be confused with Skillless, Capped, or Papega guides, but without further ado, let's jump into the video. Now, the first round that we gotta break down is undoubtedly the most important singular round in the entire game, and it's that pistol round, where a lot of the time, if you win that pistol round, it can set you up to snowball for the rest of the game, where you win round after round, all the while stacking money, and you create this insurmountable wall for the enemies that can make it really hard for them to come back into the game. Now, the first thing that you need to be thinking about when you are going into that first pistol round is, where are you fighting? Because a lot of people don't think about this before they buy. They buy first and then think about what are they going to be doing after the fact, but that's not how it should be at all. Because the really big difference between picking Classic, Ghost, or Frenzies, those guns all have strengths and weaknesses, and depending on how you are going to play the round out, that is really going to change what weapon you want to pick. If you're planning on rushing, maybe something like a Frenzy or a Classic will be much better, but maybe if you want to play in default, poke for damage, or play for mid control, maybe having a good amount of Ghosts could be better as well. This is something really important that you need to talk about as a team and make a plan before you actually buy your weapons. Now, the next thing is ability use, of course. People need to know what abilities they want to use depending on what sides of the map they're going to be pushing. It seems pretty obvious, but you would be surprised how little some players think about this until they just auto buy their abilities and then they don't actually push a point where they could use them most effectively. For instance, let's say you're a character like Sage, right? On some places, her Sage Wall can do a lot more than others, and maybe you can decide whether or not you want that Sage Wall or some other abilities, or even a Classic versus a Ghost, or whatever the case may be, depending on where you are pushing, and you need to think about that and know that ahead of time. Now, the next thing that you need to be thinking about on pistol round to have the most effective win rate is what fits best in your individual character. What is your game plan? And this is getting away from that team play aspect and going more in line with what you specifically want to do and how are you most effective individually. One of the big problems in pistol rounds and just ranked in general is sometimes it's hard to get your team to play things on the same page. But luckily for you, pistol round is one of the most carryable rounds in the entire game, where your impact alone can literally like 1v3 enemies if you play it correctly. So playing a combo with your character that even goes against the grain but is going to make you most effective can be the right way to go about it. For instance, maybe you're playing a really close defensive angle and you know that you can get a kill and get out as Jet, so you want to play something like even a Frenzy. Or maybe you're really feeling your aim that day and you're REYNA, you think you can get that one-shot kill or double tap someone and get your heal off, and then you're this unstoppable force. Understanding what weapons go with your specific character and your game plan is one of the best ways to have the most singular impact and carry the most amount of pistol rounds. Now, let's move on to number 3. We just mentioned her, but this is a big problem, and it's the REYNA problem, and players are feeding to REYNAs throughout every rank, and this is a problem that I need to put to rest right now. We all know that REYNA has one of the highest, if not the highest, pick rates across every single rank, but REYNA is so specifically powerful on pistol round, it is not even fair. Getting that Ghost pistol and being able to kill people and get to max HP again and again with armor, that is just something that can quickly get out of hand. And a lot of players are trying to take solo duels with REYNAs all over the place. You do not want to be challenging a REYNA alone, and if you can force her to use her Dismiss over her Devour, that might be just one of the best things you could possibly have happen. Some players think, oh, I'm gonna take this duel with this REYNA in isolation because if we fight her together, she gets a kill, she can always just dismiss out, right? Wrong. You do not want her to get that heal off. She gets to 150 HP, and what does anyone do about about it. She can easily clean up your entire team if you feed her that first kill, so at a primary level, it is your job to not take a solo duel with Reyna. If you see her, call her out. If your ally is going after her, go in with her. Whatever you have to do to make sure that Reyna doesn't get to take solo duels again and again and get supercharged to that 150 HP ghost wielding ace machine. Now, speaking of Reyna in particular, there are other big characters that you have to think about their abilities, and it's very specific how you play around them. And the two ones that first come to mind would be specifically Jett and Killjoy. So first, let's talk about Jett, which is the smaller of the two, but it's just really important for you to iterate to your team when she doesn't have her dash, as that is one of those kills that can give their team a numbers advantage, and it's really important that you actually call that out and relay that to your team. But more importantly, I want to talk about Killjoy, because one of the big problems with Killjoy as a character, in my personal opinion, is that she can be completely oppressive when people don't have armor and when people don't have guns that can easily kill her utility. This is why if you plan to rush a site, you do not want to be rushing a site that Killjoy has her utility on, and a lot of the time, depending on your team composition, it might be best for you to find where that Killjoy is at and just move along to the other site so you don't have to deal with her utility at all, because between all of her different forms of utility, it could be a complete nightmare to push a site. And even if you want to deal with her turret, her alarm bot, her nano swarm, you're either going to lose people or you're going to burn through your health in the process. It can be extremely annoying, I know, but unless you have some form of heal on your team, some form of sustain, then you don't want to be trading damage with like a Killjoy turret. And if you do want to trade damage with a Killjoy turret, make sure the person that is shooting the turret is someone that doesn't have armor so that they can get healed up back to full rather than your armor just getting busted off of all the people that are trying to peek this utility. And the last thing that you got to think about in that first pistol round is attack versus defense, and what you are going to play as far as weapons and what abilities you are going to buy can dramatically shift. Now also, you need to think about where you're going to be holding, because depending on where you're holding, a more long range weapon like a ghost might be far better than a closer range weapon like a classic, and you're not going to want to be peeking longer angles with a classic. So if that's something that you want to do, maybe you got to think about a weapon switch up. But something that you need to keep in mind, specifically on pistol rounds in general, is that rushes are more common. So regardless of whether you're playing attack or defense, you need to understand that as a team, you're probably going to be rushing more and what abilities go better with that rush. And as defensive players, you need to understand enemies are going to be rushing much quicker. So what can I buy that will stop said rush? So for instance, maybe prioritizing buying extra flashes is something you want to do as a duelist, because you want to rush with your team and you need those flashes to do that rush. And maybe as a sentinel or even a controller, you need to prioritize things like mollies and slows and other things like that to prevent a rush from happening, because that's going to happen far more. And these are just things that you need to be thinking about so you don't get caught off guard when you're playing your games in pistol round. Now, because you just unsubscribed to Pro Guides, you got so much better at Valorant that of course you won that first pistol round, and now you're in that secondary round where you are deciding what you should buy up to, if you're even gonna buy up at all. Now, there isn't one diehard rule like always buy or always save or what to buy, but there are some things that you could be thinking about to let you pick the best choices here, because a misstep here can let the enemy team turn the tables, forcing and winning that secondary round when you have all the advantages in your favor. Now, the first thing that you gotta imagine could happen is the enemy team forces, and that's always the fear. And there are two big things that enemy teams are typically gonna force into. They're gonna force into the high skill weapons, aka the sheriff or the marshal. Typically, the sheriff is what they would force into here because it has the one-shot capability, or they are gonna force into the close range insta-kill weapons, things like a stinger or a shotgun, and there are various options in that regard. Now, there is something that you can do that the enemy team can't do, and one, it is force buying a weapon that has better effective range and less of a need to go all in, and you get to full buy your abilities plus armor, and these are all things that are very, very important. For example, a weapon like a Spectre can play outside the effective range of weapons like stingers and shotguns, and it has a large enough magazine size to take on multiple enemies. But here's the one thing that you need to be doing every single time when you're taking a site when you have better weapons, and it's to trade death best for control. A lot of the time, when you are pushing onto site, even if you use utility, sometimes you flash out or even use a whole bunch of other utility and an enemy is still hiding behind a corner trying to get that shotgun kill or whatever he is trying to do with the stinger. Now, the weaknesses of these weapons is they're very poor at getting multiple kills in a row, and on top of that, they are really easy to play around after you know exactly where that person is and what weapon they have, because you can play outside of their effective range. So, for instance, you run onto point and someone gets a shorty kill, that needs to be a kill that is refragged 100% of the time. And yes, you will lose people when you are taking site control up against some of these guns, but that is okay, and here's the reason why. If the enemy team all have weapons like this, after you take that site control, hold on site and hold longer sight lines, enemies are not going to be able to cheese a kill back on you. If you never gave up any weapons to the enemy team, now the enemies are going to have to retake the point and fight back for point control when they have weapons that do not work very well for that at all. As long as you are actively keeping line of sight of your allies, holding an open space where enemies have to peek a long range LOS of you, you're going to put the enemy team in an impossible retake scenario, but that first step is most important, trading sometimes unavoidable deaths for point control and making sure you refrag every single time while quickly identifying what weapons the enemy players have. Now, something else in that forced buy-up round that you really need to keep in mind is slower is typically better when you are buying up. If your entire team is buying things like bulldogs and specters, it's actually better for you to play really slow. Make sure you don't rush anything so that enemies don't catch you off guard. And when enemies make a mistake, you know, they try to jiggle peek an angle or they reveal their location, you capitalize on them with utility because you can afford that, and a lot of times they can't afford all the utility they would want. Or you could take an engagement that they just have no chance of winning. For example, if an enemy is behind a corner with a shorty, but you know exactly where they are because they tried to jiggle peek you or whatever the case may be, you are really easily going to be able to avoid that player altogether or wide swing them in a way where you get a free kill on them. Now let's talk about the biggest mistake that happens in buy-up rounds, and it's one of the biggest reasons why players lose buy-up rounds even when their entire team force buys up, and it's allowing the enemy to get a kill for free and giving up your precious guns. It is so important in this round to always refrag, and if an ally drops a really powerful gun, you cannot just give it up to enemies for free, and that is why it's so important to not go isolated somewhere alone with a really powerful weapon like a bulldog, die to something dumb like a shorty, and give the enemy a weapon that can turn the tide of battle in their favor. This is also why in that buy-up round, the most important thing that you need to buy every single time is armor. And I know a lot of you like to buy that rifle, buy up to that rifle and buy light armor, but here's the reason why that could be a huge liability for the exact thing that we just talked about. If the enemy gets a cheeky right-click Bucky kill on you and barely did enough damage for you to not secure that kill, and they get to take your weapon, now all of a sudden your entire team could be completely screwed in a retake for that strategy that we talked about, where you hold on point and hold longer angles that are outside the effective range for what the enemy could possibly buy. Well, guess what? You just gave them a weapon that can fight in longer effective range than your teammates, and now that same positional strategy and strategy altogether just crumbles because of one mistake you made, and that really turns a small mistake, a small getting killed mistake, into a mistake that could just throw the entire round and maybe even throw the entire game because of the cascading snowball. I mean, that enemy team actually threw you off your balance and they get an AR to play with their bonuses from all the guns that your team gave them. Now, of course, typically when you are buying up, you also need to be thinking about attack versus defense, where you're holding, what your style and strategy is, and that's gonna really shift up what you want to buy into. And of course, where you are specifically holding also takes a really big factor into that as well. Like if you're holding garage on defense, even if you won that first round, you don't necessarily need to trade up into a lot better weapons. Getting your abilities and something like a stinger is fine because you're only fighting in a very close effective range. So thinking about all these factors together can really help you decide what weapon is perfect for you in that buy-up round. Now let's talk about that secondary scenario where you went to the skill cap website and learned absolutely nothing. Well, now you're in a lost second round and you're deciding whether or not you should force buy so you can win that second round and really mess up the enemy's economy and prevent their snowball. Now, one of the big problems with force buying in general is, yes, it's powerful, but players don't really understand why they're force buying at all. They just decide it on a whim, but there are several things that you should be thinking about before you decide to force buy, because it can be a really big liability where you not only lose that pistol round, but that secondary round, and then you're gonna have to save on that third round, and it's not gonna be be at least until the 4th round until you can buy freaking rifles. Well, the first thing that you need to think about is what map are you on and what composition does the enemy team have and what composition do you have. And what I'm talking about are character compositions. What agents do you have and what tools do you have to actually execute a force correctly and make it so that you win a round? The first thing that I would like you to look at is how much stall does an enemy have. One of the best things about force buying, especially on attack, is rushing down the enemy, quickly pushing in. They aren't expecting it. You rush in with stingers because that's one of the best weapons you can afford, and enemies are just completely caught off guard. They can't stop the stall, and you get kills while taking site control, and then you put enemies in a really bad retake scenario. Now, if the enemy have a whole bunch of stall, a lot of AoE, things like mollies, killjoy turrets, and all stuff like that, maybe you want to think twice before you execute a rush like this, because it's going to be very difficult to do all this through smokes, through utility, and all that stalling capability, and it's far better up against stuff like that to rely on the gunplay power level of having an AR rather than trying to just rush it through. So maybe it's better for you to just save that secondary round and get ARs in that 3rd round instead. Now, the next thing that you got to think about is how much engage do you have? Do you have a whole bunch of engage to actually execute a rush in that force buy round? Like, for instance, let's say that you have a lot of duelists, a lot of flashes, and a lot of ways to take that site very quickly and very easily, and the enemy doesn't have a lot of stall. Force buying on attack is something that you should do every single time because enemies are not going to be prepared for it, and they're not going to have the ability tools to stop you even if they are prepared for it. Now, the next thing that you need to understand about a force buy is that it's high risk, high reward, and more than likely, like 90% of the time or more, after you tried force buying one round, if you lost that round, you need to full save the preceding round, or at least buy down to where you can buy your abilities plus your AR to get a full reset on that 4th round, because you don't want to end up in a cycle where you just force buy into loss, into loss, into loss, keep force buying, keep losing, and enemies just keep shutting you down again and again and again. A lot of times this happened because you never thought about the first thing that we talked about, specifically what type of abilities the enemies have to prevent you from getting value out of your force. Now, the next thing that you need to do every time you force buy is hide information about a force. It's really good if enemies are caught completely off guard by a force. Maybe they're going in, they're like, hey, free eco frags, and they swing around the corner with their Spectre because they're really cocky, and there's 2 of y'all with stingers just staring back at them, and you get a free kill, and you just get to storm the point for free. And these are mistakes that enemies are only gonna make when they don't know that you're force buying up. Now, as far as what to force into, typically the best for attacking on a rush is stingers, but that is only typically for the people that want to take initial site control. I wouldn't fault you for rocking something like a sheriff if you're playing a controller or a sentinel in the back of the pack, because you could still provide value from back by default, and you want to remain way more passive than the rest of your team because you want to be alive to use all your abilities, and you can still put damage from afar. Now, that being said, there are a lot of other weapons that can get value out of forcing even if you lose, depending on how competent you are with them or specific scenarios with your character. For instance, like forcing an LMG on defense to hold with Sova can be really powerful in a force buy round. But if you want to see exactly how to pop off on eco rounds, then go to the gameplay website in the links down below for in-depth advanced VOD reviews showing you step by step exactly what you need to do to pop off in these force buy eco rounds and just dominate pistol rounds again and again so that you can easily climb. But I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for coming by. Please follow me on Twitter at CoachMillsOW. But that's all I got for you right now. See you tomorrow.